What exactly does a spiky ball taste like? Let's find out. Hello Whisky fans, it's time for another Ardbeg. It's time for another Ardbeg committee release because this is Ardbeg's expression for Feis Ile Ardbeg Day this year, 2022. It's Ardbeg Ardcore. So before we get into anything else, I'm going to mention the price on this one because committee releases almost always are pricey, very expensive. The price on this one is about £100 here in the UK, so it is lower than some recent committee releases from Ardbeg, but it's still kind of the equivalent of 3 Talisker 10s or 2 and a bit Ardbeg 10-year-olds. So even though this is significantly cheaper than the Ardbeg Fermutation at £150, probably much cheaper than the next Supernova release from Ardbeg's going to be, you're still having to pay a premium for this based on it being special or at least different. Also worth pointing out that this is Ardbeg's first foray into black malt or black patent malt or heavily charred roasted barley being used to make this whiskey. And the other one that a lot of people are going to be familiar with is Glenmorangie Signet, which is also made with black malt, and this is significantly cheaper than Glenmorangie Signet sells for these days. It's also, and this is kind of the hot topic from Ardbeg that nobody really cared about, it's significantly cheaper than Ardbeg Fenoge. Fenoge. Ardbeg Fenoge. Does anyone kind of get the impression that the Gaelic-speaking distilleries are kind of trolling the entire English-speaking world with some of their Gaelic-named releases? This one here, though, Ardbeg Ardcore, is a little bit easier to pronounce. Although I'm sure there's a lot of Brits out there that, like myself, feel a little bit uncomfortable because you kind of feel like you're being forced to drop an H that's not really there. Anyway, details on this one, the Ardbeg Ardcore. It's 50.1% ABV, and we're told by Ardbeg that it's made with black malt, or as I said before, also known as chocolate malt, or sometimes called black patent malt. So that means that the barley that's gone into this whiskey, normally you don't really roast the barley that you use for whiskey. It's more of a thing in beer. Usually with whiskey it's kilned, so it's just heated to stop the germination process. But the barley that goes into this one, it's been roasted to basically the highest level that you use in beer production. So it's kind of similar to some of the barley that they use in the production of things like Guinness or Stout. But whereas in beer making, you typically use no more than around 10% of your kind of mash bill is going to be composed of that heavily charred black malt. Because if you go over about 10% when you're making beer, it tends to get a little bit unbalanced and a little bit unpleasant. With this new Ardbeg, they're leading us to believe that it's made with 100% black patent malt, although they don't actually say either way if that's true. And I kind of get the impression with this one, it puts me in a mind of Ardbeg Scotch. There's this kind of connection between this one, which was made with heavily charred barley, and the Scotch, which was obviously made with heavily charred casks. So Ardbeg know their audience. They know that we all like our heavily peated, smoky, charred, burnt whiskies, and they're capitalising on that. So it will be interesting to see if that level of char in the malt translates to a similar charred black kind of smokiness as to what we got in the Scotch. So other details from the label on this one, I think I've mentioned already, it's 50.1% ABV. So this is the committee release version of this whiskey. There is going to be a 46% ABV one coming out as well. This one was exclusively available from Ardbeg Embassies and the Ardbeg website, which we all know is a massive pain in the arse, because it means that we all have to log on to a website, you have to remember what your password is, which can be quite a challenge for some of us, and then you have to sit and just wait. Like, when you express your interest in this, if anyone out there's never done this for an Ardbeg committee release, you basically have to go on there at the certain time that it goes on sale, and you get put into kind of like an automated queue. and you just have to wait for that page to refresh, and you hope that it refreshes into the page where you can put the bottle into your cart and go through the checkout process, and hope that you just don't sit there for the best part of an hour to be met with a page that tells you that you haven't been lucky. I really wish that Ardbeg would just switch over to some sort of ballot system, even if you had to do what some other companies do where you have to pay in advance and then you get refunded if you're not drawn out of the hat. That would just be, especially for those of us who have to go to work, which is probably most of us if you're considering spending this much on whiskey, it would be so much more convenient than having to sit and stare at a page for an hour. Anyway, other details on the label. We know that it is non-chill filtered. You probably can't read that because it won't go in focus, but you have to trust me there. It doesn't mention anywhere that this is natural colour, which is kind of a running theme with Ardbeg. It probably is. I don't think that Ardbeg are adding colour into any of their whiskies. I might be wrong, but they just never bother to say either way. So the label for this one, I will move it close to the camera so you can have a good look. Hopefully that will come into focus one day. There we go. So they've gone for a kind of punk theme with this release, and it's the kind of playful, tongue-in-cheek style that we're getting with a lot of our committee releases from Ardbeg lately. Some people really hate it. They're kind of not taking themselves seriously, and you probably fall on one side of the fence or the other as to whether you like that or not. I think it's okay. Just show you the back label as well. So there's a nice little cartoon of Shorty, the Ardbeg dog. Do not drink and drive, do not get pregnant and be drunk, do not be under 18, and always throw everything in the bin, is what that's saying, I think. And in the top corner there, black malt. So one thing that's obviously missing from this release is an age statement. So that's not a surprise. Ardbeg quite often release no age statement whiskey, and when there is an age statement, it's always insanely expensive. But just going back to the price one last time for a second, the thing that bothers me most about the price of this one isn't that it's a £100 bottle of Ardbeg, it's the fact that it's a no age statement expression. No age statement whiskey, in my opinion, should cost 3 figures. And that's not because NAS no age statement whiskey can't be good, it's because when you're paying that much money, you deserve transparency. Nobody, as far as I saw, ever complained about Wee Beastie from Ardbeg being a 5-year-old whiskey. A lot of people thought that it was really brave and a really good thing that Ardbeg had trusted us to know that the stuff in that bottle was a minimum of 5 years old. And I don't think anyone would complain if this one had a young age statement on it either, providing the whiskey's good. Ardbeg's FAQ for this whiskey does kind of preempt people asking the age statement question, and on there they have a bit of a cop-out statement saying it's a non-aged expression, which, if that is true, then they kind of need to take the statement that this is a single malt off the label, because as we all know, single malt requires a whiskey to be an aged expression. A lot of these distilleries, if you press them hard enough, they'll say that the reason why they make whiskey's no age statement is so that people don't complain that it should be older for the price tag. And I get that, especially when you're selling expensive whiskey. Everyone likes to charge a high price for what they're selling, after all. When you're selling expensive whiskey, if there's anything at all that people can complain about and say that that's bad value, then people are going to pick up on that, and I can understand that they don't want to give that ammo to people to throw back at them. But me personally, and I think that you guys out there, you shouldn't complain about a whiskey purely based on how old it is, especially when you're talking about some peated expressions. What you should complain about is distilleries charging a high price for things and not giving us every single detail that they can. If these distilleries want to charge a high price for a whiskey, tell us why we should pay a high price for it. Tell us about all of the extraordinary lengths, all of the experimentation and R&D that you have put into this whiskey that makes it worth £100. And all of you whiskey fans, this is just my opinion and my advice, but don't necessarily rule out a whiskey just because it's young, because some whiskey can be really, really good. What you should do is judge a whiskey by how it tastes. If you can try a whiskey before you buy it, judge a whiskey, if you can, by its flavour and its presentation. Ask the distillery, what is their attention to the barley that they use? Do they have their own floor maltings? What's their attention to casks? Are they offering a good ABV? Are they chill filtering? Me personally, I'd much rather pay £50 for a 5-year-old Kilchoman Mackay Bay at 46%. Much rather have that than pay £30 for a 12-year-old 40% ABV Glenlivet. And I'm sure a lot of you guys out there feel exactly the same. At the end of the day, it should all come down to quality and attention to detail. And transparency is one of the key ways that distilleries can let us know that they're serious about quality. So, in my opinion, transparency is always good. So, Ardbeg Ardcore 50.1%, Ardbeg Day release for 2022. The final year of the plague, hopefully. Obviously, Feis Ile is starting to return to Islay in person now. So any of you that really want to get out there and enjoy the festivities, get to the distilleries in person and stand in a massive crowd of people, all fighting to try the same whiskies in a really loud room. If that's your thing, you can probably get out to Islay and enjoy that now. Me personally, I'm going to be getting any Feis Ile bottles that are available and reasonably priced and enjoying them at home, including this one here, Ardbeg Ardcore on the nose. Shy and a little bit empty. Not to say that there aren't aromas to pick up there, and not to say that it's a bad whiskey, but it is very, very light and quite subdued. Aromas that I am picking up, I'm getting a little bit of a dark roast coffee aroma, a little bit of chocolate in there. Also, unsurprisingly, getting some notes of burnt grains, burnt barley, and a little bit of menthol, and obviously that's got to be coming through from the Ardbeg spirit. Menthol's not a note that I normally rank up there as some of the more obvious tasting notes on an Ardbeg, but definitely kind of taking centre stage in this one. Curiously though, this one from Ardbeg, I'd say that it's definitely burnt on the nose, but with minimal peat considering it's an Ardbeg. Also getting a little hint of spirity peach note on the nose. So in a way, kind of reminds me a little bit of a young Irish whiskey. The average Ardbeg, I think, does nose the spirity side of Ardbeg, noses more mature than this one does. Also getting a heavy, briny mineral note on the nose of this whiskey, and it does come across a little bit young. It's not an enormous showstopper, but it does seem like a reasonably immature young whiskey. Let's see how it tastes. So, colour of this one is absolutely not the palest Ardbeg that I've seen, because a lot of batches of the more bourbon refill matured Ardbegs are very, very pale. Almost the colour of water they have been in the past. This one's a little bit darker than that, but definitely does seem to be natural colour. Again, on the palate I'm getting some dark roast coffee notes, more chocolatiness. There's quite a sweet note to this whiskey. It's quite refined and focused, getting some sweet and crystallised sort of barley sugar, sugary maltiness. It does remind me a little bit of something like a peated grain whiskey. There's a little bit of similarity between this and the peated grain whiskey from Loch Lomond, although to be honest I'd say I probably prefer the Loch Lomond. The body of this one though, just like most grain whiskies, it's got a very, very light body. It's only really towards the late palate that you start to get some slight lemon, citrus and disinfectant kind of notes, floor cleaner. And when some of those kind of more spirity, malt-driven notes do start to come out, you actually get a delightful sharpness on the palate of this one, and I do wonder if that's what Ardbeg are getting at when they say that it's like biting a spiky ball, because there's really not that much, there's not many aggressive, offensive, ballsy flavours in this one. It's really in my opinion, all to do with the contrast between those burnt cereal notes and that very sharp, focused, almost grain whiskey-like, sharp, fruity notes. It's going to have one more sip. There's definitely a distinct burntness to the palate of this whiskey. Getting some more charcoal notes, kind of similar to what I got on the palate of Ardbeg Scotch. And I must say that the palate on this one, it's a little bit mezcal-y. Anyone that's had good quality craft presentation mezcal, you get that sweet and sour and burnt smoky flavour, and there's more than a passing resemblance to that in this. As for the finish, I'm going to say thin and reasonably short, and the finish is really dominated by those dark burnt roast coffee flavours. So what do I think about Ardbeg's committee release for 2022, the Ardbeg Ardcore? Bearing in mind what I said about you shouldn't write off a whiskey because it's young, I'm not writing off this whiskey because it's a young age statement. I'm criticising lightly this whiskey because it seems like it's not that mature. And that's a different thing to writing off a whiskey because it's a young age statement. There's a difference between having spent a lot of years or not so many years in the cask and actually being a mature whiskey, because some whiskies can be very mature after a very short maturation. But this whiskey in particular, it does seem like it could probably have benefited from a little bit longer in the cask. Or perhaps it's just that chocolate malt has taken so much flavour out of the whiskey that it feels like it needs more. But in my opinion, there are certainly no taste buds being trashed at all with this release. When I've been tasting this whiskey, I've constantly found myself coming back to the question of, has that dark roasting process of the barley damaged or made it so certain things in the malt have either been damaged or removed or denatured, and because of that a lot of flavour has not got through into the finished product. That dark roasting process, the black malt, has added another dimension to this whiskey. It's definitely added something. It's not been a complete waste of time, because you've got some really nice coffee and sugary malt notes, but apart from that burntness combined with that very clean and refined barley sugar note, it's kind of a slightly barren and slightly weak seeming experience, especially seeing this, it's not a weak whiskey, it's 50.1%. But for how kind of featureless and barren this whiskey is, I would probably not recommend it. It just doesn't seem that hardcore. As for a grade, I'm probably going to give this a C+, between a C and a C+. So it's actually one of the lowest rated Ardbegs I've ever tasted. It's down there with things like the original Alligator release that I wasn't a huge fan of. I do kind of prefer the Scotch to the Alligator, and down there with things like the Ardbeg Ardcore from 2014. It's definitely a little bit subpar for what we normally expect from Ardbeg. I have actually compared this whiskey to Scotch because I've got a bit of that left, and it'd kind of be rude not to, because they're both whiskies that are riffing on this theme of burnt and charred, obviously with Scotch being charred casks, with this being charred malt. And I've compared the two to each other because I thought probably going to be reasonably similar ballpark, but that's not really what I found. I compared this against the tail end of the Scotch that I've got open, and the Scotch has just got more body, more texture, more complexity and more flavour. If anyone is ever out there and they've got the choice between this Ardcore or Scotch, I would without a doubt go for the Scotch, because they are similar things in a way, but the Scotch is better. Interestingly, something else I kept comparing this to when I was tasting it is there was a Master of Malt product quite a few years ago. I don't think they make it anymore, but it's part of Master of Malt's sort of experimental range, what they called their batch shop mental ideas. And it was cold infused, cold distilled coffee spirit. And it's definitely not the sort of thing that you would want to probably drink a whole bottle of, not something that you'd want to drink regularly. But that stuff, which was, I think it was distilled in a vacuum still, to actually draw all of the oils and flavours out of the coffee into a base spirit. And I really enjoyed that as a novelty one-off. And the dark roasted coffee notes that you get in this Ardbeg really remind me of that. As for this whisky though, the committee release from Ardbeg Ardcore, I think it really just backs up what I always say about Ardbeg committee releases. They are always interesting. They're always worth having and worth trying. Sometimes they can be absolutely exceptional, and sometimes they're not. But at the end of the day, the common theme with Ardbeg committee releases is that you always end up paying quite a bit of a premium for what you get. The other thing that you have to consider with Ardbeg committee releases is that they do often use them as kind of a way of experimenting and getting a little bit of feedback from the committee members and the fans. And I would say that things like Ardbeg fermentation, without a doubt, definitely go down that route. Maybe not as long a fermentation, but definitely experiment with longer fermentations because it can have a really nice effect on the finished whiskey. So do more of that. Ardbeg Scotch, yeah, maybe do more of that as well because that was a nice little whiskey. But the black malt, probably give that one a miss. So, all of you whiskey fans, thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of this review and what you think of this whiskey. Let me know what you think of black malt. What do you think of Glenmorangie Signet if you've had that? Do you think that roasting levels in barley are something that distilleries should be pursuing, or do you think it's a dead end? And what other experiments would you like to see in the whiskey world? Thanks for watching, and cheers.